Richard Sakwa is Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent here in the UK. He spoke to Juliet Mann and she started by asking him, what does Russia recognising those two regions as independent really mean?
Well, it means that it's lost patience. If you remember, since 2014, the first Minsk agreement that September, and then the following year, Minsk II, was about a process in which these two republics could be returned to Ukrainian sovereignty. And as we know, it was perhaps a forced deal on Kiev, and there's good reasons why they were not too happy about it. But nevertheless, it was a formula, and they allegedly were sticking to it. But basically, they were not fulfilling their side of the bargain, but Russia was the one being sanctioned. And so basically, Putin now saying, look, enough is enough. And there's another important factor in all of this, and that is that nearly 4 million people living in those republics were suffering, endless, mortar shells and sniping and so on, sniper attacks. Over 80% of the incidents in the last few years came from the Ukrainian side on these civilians. And it's like Sarajevo in the early 1990s. But there's, of course, no public sympathy for the genuine suffering which these republics have endured. And so, basically, Kremlin has said, look, it's time really to move on. Kiev's not doing its bit. We're getting sanctioned. And these people are suffering. Let's try to deal with it.
But on the other hand, Russia has made these repeated claims that they've got no plans to invade Ukraine, that they don't want to have a war. Where does that fit into this motivation?
Well, this doesn't change anything, ultimately, because those two breakaway republics were, anyway, had moved out. But the game change is huge, in one sense, because until yesterday, Moscow was saying, look, we've got the Minsk process, let's return, which is a way of getting those two back to Ukrainian sovereignty. But it was Ukraine which was not fulfilling its side of the deal. I can't understand why, the previous speaker and so on have got everything back to front. Endless sanctions, endless solidarity for what? Remember a couple of years ago, Macron said that it was NATO which was brain dead. It's the EU today, which is simply bloc solidarity, doesn't really help if it's mistaken policy. The more sanctions, the more pressure you put on Russia, the more it's going to fight back. This was identified well before Putin, way back in the mid-90s. If you're going to enlarge NATO, if you're going to keep pushing, ultimately you're going to get a backlash. Sadly, and I'm not justifying the move. I'm trying to explain how we got to where we are today.
I appreciate that. You're explaining the process and the strategy. So, in terms of what's going on and this action in Ukraine, does Putin have support for this at home?
Yes, he does. Clearly, liberals and certain people, and everybody's concerned. I mean, no one is enthusiastic. There is no war fever in Russia. And over again, I talk to Russians and they say, look, my father is Russian, my mother is Ukrainian, or vice versa, and my babushka, my grandmother, is Belarusian. So these are people entirely mixed. And the idea for war is absolutely abysmal. But don't forget again that US strategy since the mid-1990s has been very explicit. It must keep Ukraine and Russia apart. And it's actually done so exceptionally well, and we're leading to this catastrophic situation where we are today. The idea was Russia wants to seize Ukraine. It's nonsense. Just one other important point now, and that is that it's quite likely that Russia will declare a sort of a demilitarized zone some 15, 20 kilometers around the republics to stop the sniping and the other attacks on civilians. And if Ukrainians do not pull back that amount, then it will be a kinetic war. It won't be an invasion. It will be battles to push back and try to protect these republics. That's, as far as I can see, the logical next step. So it's not an invasion, but it will mean yet more confrontation and hostility. Sanctions are irrelevant here. I mean, it's not a question of the bloc solidarity. It's that sort of closed thinking which has got us to where we are today. Fortunately, France and Germany have occasionally come up with their own ideas, but they've been disciplined and pushed back into the box.
So more conflict, more hostility, that's what you're expecting. But, are sanctions really irrelevant? They're being drafted by the United States, Europe, the UK. I mean, what would the worst-case scenario for Russia be as far as the impact those sanctions could have?
Well, it's awful. I mean, it's a dreadful thing. And obviously, it depresses economic growth, reduces investment, makes life very difficult. But it's got a war chest of over $600 billion in reserves, and they've been preparing for this. The point is, instead of sanctions, why don't people actually talk to Moscow and say, look, I mean, on the 17th of December, as we know, Russia put forward some ideas for this European Security Treaty. Then the Western response was rather niggardly. Then Russia earlier this week said, clearly our concerns were ignored, and now this is the result. So diplomacy actually means talking and dealing with substantive issues. They have not actually been doing so with Russia since the mid-90s. I keep saying this. We're talking about a 25-year pushback against Moscow. It's back. It feels its back is to the wall. I'm not saying it's a justified feeling again, but it's certainly that's the way they see it. And, it behooves anybody who deals with diplomacy to see and put themselves in the position of the other. And, of course, another game changer is the joint statement with China on the 4th of February. But that's another issue. But it's important because it gives a background to what's happening.